followed the motto, Fiat Lux, found the light, came to Cal, and has been there for about 25 years now. He's published, he's written several books, and has received numerous awards over his career, culminating a couple years ago with the Nobel Prize in economic science. So, as always, I'd rather you listen to him than me. So, without further ado, Professor David Carter.
All right.
Thank you, Chris. Thank everyone for coming. Nice to meet the Sveriges group. I'm actually a resident of Bennett Valley for 20 years. This spring, we've had a house on just down the street a little bit. So, but I've never actually been here before, so it's very nice to be in this restaurant.
Microphone close.
Oh, okay. How's that?
Yeah,
better? Okay. So Chris asked me a couple of questions just to set the stage, and then I'm going to try and answer the questions that were posed by membership. First, let me say a little bit what I do. I'm what's called a labor economist. And labor economics is kind of the study of what people do. So many people think of economics as like study of banking or the macroeconomy, but there's a big part of economics which is really related to questions like how do you decide how long to stay in school, how do you decide what occupation to pursue, how do you decide whether you want to live in California or New York, or immigrate to a different country, how do you decide who to marry, how do you decide the number of children to have, what kind of job to have, those kind of questions. And that's a very micro level, and then a little bit higher level, there's a lot of analysis that people like me do about questions like how does the choice of a number of migrants to come to a local labor market affect earnings there for people that were already there. For instance, I'll talk in a few seconds about a study I did along those lines. Another question I worked on a lot would be questions like, if more people get educated, does that somehow change the earnings difference between highly educated and less well-educated people? So if you think about a supply and demand kind of story, is it really true that if you have more highly educated people, that the benefit of a college education goes down, or is there something else going on? And so our field has had a lot of impact in economics over the last 30 or so years, largely because we're the part of economics that's the most data-driven. Most of the people do research which is very closely related to data. And in the last 30 or 40 years, the amount of data that we have available for our research has really expanded enormously. So we have amazing amounts of information available from all kinds of records that are being used to try and study questions like when someone moves from one city to another city, how much would their wages go up? And is it really the case that we all know that San Francisco, for instance, pays higher wages than St. Louis? But how much of that difference is because the people that work in San Francisco would earn more even if they were in St. Louis? And how much of it is due to the question or a difference that it's actually the case that somehow you become more productive when you move to San Francisco? So a lot of our research is also related to a very simple but fundamental idea in science, which is everyone probably has heard the term that correlation is not the same as causality. And so what we try and do a lot, and probably why I won the Nobel Prize, was in trying to understand how to sort out, at least a little bit better, the difference between correlation and causality. So one of the studies that I did in the 1990s with a couple of colleagues at Princeton was trying to study the effect of rising minimum wage. And that was a fairly controversial topic, still is somewhat controversial. And at the time, my co-author and I had done some other studies, and we found out, we were sitting in New Jersey, we found out that the state was going to raise the minimum wage in about 2 months. There was a new bill in the state legislature. So we thought, well, this would be a really interesting opportunity to study that. And what we did was we surveyed a whole bunch of restaurants in the part of New Jersey that's along the Pennsylvania border. And at the same time, we surveyed a whole bunch of restaurants on the Pennsylvania side of the same border. And then the minimum wage went up, and 8 months later, we went back and surveyed all those firms again. And all we did was we just said, well, what had happened to employment on both sides of the border? And then we reported those results. Now, so this is the kind of thing that you can almost, you don't really need a PhD in economics to think about. But it does allow you to sort out this causal idea, because you've got, in the same way that you have in an experiment, when you've got like a group of people who take a drug and a group of people who don't. In our setting, we had a group of restaurants that were affected by the minimum wage on the New Jersey side, and the kind of control group on the other side, Pennsylvania. And that turned out to be a fairly important idea in economics. Nowadays, virtually everybody doing research in the labor economics area and in many other areas uses techniques like that. Another paper that I wrote, which was cited by the Nobel Committee when I got the award, was a study of the effect of immigration. So everyone is aware that when you're thinking about migrating to a new country, you're not necessarily going to move to the worst city in that country. You're probably going to move where there's good job opportunities and where you maybe know people. So it's kind of hard to sort out when you see a place with more migrants. It doesn't look like wages are lower, unemployment is higher in that place. You may say, well, actually, it's because the migrants go where the job opportunities are. They might be depressing job opportunities a little bit, but they're always going to go in kind of the opposite direction. So I had the idea, it really came about from a student I worked with at Princeton in a project he was pitching. And he'd grown up in Miami. And if anybody remembers, back in early 1980, there was an event called the Memory of Alfred Nobel. And probably most people on the west side of the country don't know about it, but you've all seen the movie Scarface. And so that's basically a story about what happened in 1980, mid-1980. Fidel Castro had a kind of a political event. He had like 70,000 people that wanted to leave Miami, or excuse me, wanted to leave Havana. And they were all clumped into the embassy of one of the South American countries. And we threatened to get out of hand, so we just said, okay, screw it. Everybody wants to leave, they can do that. They can just, anybody can come and pick them up. So what happened is all the Cubans in Miami organized flotillas of boats to come pick up people from Havana and move them back to Miami. So in the course of like 3 months, 150,000 people moved to Miami. And so I sort of got this idea from the student, as I said, had the idea of trying to study what happened as a result of this very quick inflow of people to Miami. And if you remember the Scarface story, a lot of them were not particularly highly educated. A lot of them actually were, a couple of thousand of them were ex-criminals, people that Castro wanted to get rid of anyway. So it wasn't a highly selected group. It wasn't like your best and brightest kind of type of people. And again, I had this idea, I needed a comparison group. So what I did was over the 10 years after the boat lift, I had a study which showed what happened to wages and unemployment rates of native workers of various levels of education in Miami relative to what happened in a group of other cities, which in the 10 years prior to the boat lift had kind of tracked the same as Miami. So it wasn't exactly the same as New Jersey and Pennsylvania, but it was sort of getting at that idea. I wanted to have a set of cities which on average were moving like Miami, so that I could say, well, if nothing else had happened, they probably should have continued to move like Miami. So that, again, that's an idea that people are using a lot these days. Chris asked me a little bit to talk a little bit about how the Nobel Prize works. So the way it seems to work is there's a bunch of Swedish people in different fields, and they are organized in this academy, and they have their big project is to each year select Nobel Prize winners in different areas. So physics, chemistry, medicine, and so on. And there's one group of these people that are selecting the prize in economics. Now, it's important to remember that Mr. Nobel did not put aside money for a prize in economics. So the Nobel Prize in Economics is not actually called the Nobel Prize in Economics. It's called the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics, and it's funded by the Bank of Sweden. So there's this committee, and they have these very top secret meetings, but everyone who's like over 55 or 60 at a higher level university will get a letter each year and say, who do you think should win the Nobel Prize? And then they kind of sift through this, and they keep an eye on different fields. And when they've gotten an idea that they might consider somebody, they then ask people to write a prospective citation. And about 20 years ago, I did that for a person who taught at Columbia University for much of his career. He was a pretty famous labor economist, but he didn't win the Nobel Prize. So I wrote my 30-page citation, all this research, spent like a month on it, and they kind of rejected it. But you don't really know you're being considered. You don't know that you've got a chance. What happens is at 2 in the morning, well, California time, 11 in the morning, Sweden time, they announce it. So what happened to me was, actually I was at Bennett Valley here. I just gotten back from visiting my mother in Canada, and I'd flown into SFO. The plane was a little late. Got in around 10:30 at night, and I drove up to Santa Rosa. I was having a shower at about 2 in the morning, and my wife said, "I got this weird." Her cell phone, our phone in Berkeley, forwards to her cell phone. She said, "There's a weird call on our phone in Berkeley." And so we listened to it and said, please call us about the Nobel Prize. And I thought, well, I just got back from Canada, and my old friend from high school is a real jokester. And we've been talking at dinner over a couple of bottles of wine about the Nobel Prize in Economics, and who's going to win that. And I thought, this is just his kind of joke. But it turned out it was actually called Sweden, so we eventually figured that out and returned the call. So you don't really know about it until it happens. And then it's kind of a nice thing for your ex-students. I have in my career, I've had about 150 PhD students that I've worked with, so quite a few. And so if someone like me wins the Nobel Prize, it's good for them. Like they can kind of blurt it over to their friends, and then they get to invite me to come and give a talk or something. I'm not entirely sure it's so great for me. I mean, there is some cash involved, but it's kind of, I get asked to do a lot of things that I would think, well, if I didn't win that prize, I could have been, having the afternoon off. So it's plus and minus. And then Chris asked me a little bit, well, maybe I'll stop there and let him ask his questions. Yeah.
Okay, so I put out the request, and many of you did reply. And so I've sort of sliced and diced because his specialty is labor economics, but we thought since we have a guy here that is an economist that we couldn't miss the obvious. So he's going to start with a little rendition on where are we right now in the economy, inflation, recession, is it looming? So maybe take just a few minutes there.
So when people ask me this is the question I most get asked. What's going to happen to the economy? What's going to happen to interest rates? That's the kind of thing that people think that economists know about. And a small fraction do. And I have some colleagues who work in this area. So I always try and figure out what they're saying so that when someone asks me this, I can just repeat their answers. So here's what the wisdom is, I think, from my colleagues who are most knowledgeable, and a little bit some of my own slant on it. It's a time of great uncertainty about what the economy is going to do. People, I think, 6 months ago were fairly pessimistic and thought that the economy had overheated a little bit after the stimulus from COVID and other things. And the Fed was raising interest rates pretty aggressively. At the same time, we had the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and we had quite a bit of turmoil in international markets because of what's going on in China. First the COVID thing, and then kind of the trade war between U.S. and China. So all of those things look like sort of negative signals. And I think most economists, like 2/3, were sort of predicting we would go into a recession. Not necessarily as bad as the Great Recession, which of course was the worst one since the Great Depression, but maybe more like a recession we had in 1991, which was pretty bad in California, but nationally not quite as bad. Subsequently, if you've been following the news, you'll see that everyone says, well, the market's still resilient. Inflation has moderated a little bit. This recent numbers, wholesale inflation was actually negative, so prices went down a little bit. And there's quite a bit of debate among economists and among the people at the Federal Reserve who are interpreting the data as to whether inflation will continue at a little bit higher rate than they want, or whether it's actually going to go down even if they don't do anything. Now then, the confound on top of all of that uncertainty was the banking situation last week, which I think a lot of people think is going to make the Federal Reserve slow down their interest rate increases, because when they raised interest rates, all the banks that have long-term bonds that they bought in the past, so 2-year, 3-year, 5-year bonds, 10-year bonds, take big capital losses because those bonds are no longer worth as much. And and they're very concerned about causing a banking crisis. Because that's more or less how the Great Recession started. And banks always look like they're very stable until someone looks under the hood and it turns out they're not. As Chris can tell us as a former banker himself. So I think that the general perception is that there's still some risk that will tip into recession. To some extent, it's a recession that's a choice of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has really only one tool to slow down inflation, and that's to raise interest rates and cause at least a slowdown in economic growth, if not a recession. And in the past, all of the times when they've said, okay, we've got to fight inflation and we've got to induce interest rate increases, in the past, I think since the 1930s, there's been 5 or 6 episodes like that. My colleagues have studied them very intensively, and they believe that in every single case, they caused at least a small recession. So that's the reasoning, I think, behind the more pessimistic people. The more optimistic people are in the crowd of "this time is different," which is a common phrase, which normally is not true. So keep that in mind.
All right, thank you. All right, here's one. Comment, if you would, please. Positive and negative impact on the labor market brought about by extreme immigration.
Okay, that's a question I worked on quite a bit. I mentioned my study of the Memory of Alfred in the 1990s and 2000s. I wrote a number of different papers on that question. And there's a lot of research on this question in other countries. We used to think of the US as one of the main countries which has got a large immigration population. But actually, in the last 20 years, many European countries have caught up and actually surpassed the US in terms of immigration. So believe it or not, there's a higher fraction of immigrants in Sweden and Norway than there are in the United States. And a lot of those are refugee migrants that they've admitted, of course, in the 1990s and 2000s. So that's created a lot of international experience as well as experience in the US. My work was studying the US. My perception was, my perception of the research is that most of the time what people find is increases in immigration have fairly small effects on the native population. Not necessarily very positive effects, not necessarily very negative effects on the labor market side. On the firm side, firms of course are normally supportive of immigration. So for instance, the employers in Santa Rosa area are pretty short of work right now, and a lot of agricultural enterprises are pretty short of work, would like to have more immigration probably. So what you typically see is the benefits of migration are to firms and particularly to employers that use a lot of labor, lower skilled labor in our area, and high skilled labor in other areas. So for instance, in San Francisco or Seattle, the tech sector is a very big user of immigrants. Something like half of all the people with a PhD in computer science are foreign-born. About a quarter of all the people with a PhD in economics are foreign-born. So we're benefiting kind of at the two ends of the labor market from arrivals of these migrants. Now, there is, I should say that my view is, I would say 75 or 80% of economists would agree with my view, but there are people who are more critical and believe that they can find in the data other evidence. I personally don't think that's as compelling evidence, but I should say you will be able to read on the internet quite a few people who are fairly critical of immigration, and particularly of my view of immigration. So, just buyer beware.
All right, thank you. Next question. What's the ideal population growth to keep inflation in control, but with reasonable wage growth?
So I should say that the part of economists who study population growth and those issues typically connect it to inflation, because that's a longer-term question. And in the longer term, inflation is caused by monetary policy, and not really it's what economists call the nominal side of the economy versus the real side of the economy. So I'll try and say a little bit about that at the end. But so in terms of population growth, the traditional view of economists is that if you can have population growth keep up with the rate of growth of capital, so keep up with the rate of investment, then the economy can have a very smooth trajectory. If you have capital growing faster than population, then normally real wages will rise, because you want to, in a typical economic model, you want to have capital and labor growing together at about the same rate. Now there are exceptions to that, but the general view is any level of population growth potentially can be accommodated as long as we can keep investment keeping pace. So that's why it was very interesting to me to study the Memory of Alfred, because that was a shock of about 7% of the workforce in a few months. And it didn't seem to cause huge problems, but that was only to one local city. A really interesting study has been done of Israel. I don't know if everybody is aware of this, but after the fall of Russia and the USSR, a very large number of Russian Jews migrated to Israel, and so it caused a huge population change there. The largest really nationwide population change that anybody has reported in modern times. And surprisingly, it's very difficult to show that hurt opportunities for natives. And some people believe that actually helped. Israel is a major place for the tech sector. A lot of people actually somewhat related to the military. So the military is very sophisticated in Israel, and a lot of people get trained in the military and then start startups and work in the tech sector. And a lot of people believe that was actually helped by bringing all these well-educated Russians who worked in statistics and physics and math into Israel in the 90s. But it's surprisingly difficult to show that big changes in population have huge effects. Now, there's some interesting thing going on in a lot of countries right now. So although we're kind of used to thinking about population growth, in fact, a preponderance of countries are going negative in population. So Korea, Italy, Spain, Japan, a lot of Asian countries are all in the negative side of population growth. China is going to turn negative like this year or last year. Germany is already negative. Even countries that are relatively prosperous are having a lot of difficulty with population. So over the next 25 or 30 years, the big question is going to be, how do we deal with population declines, not with population growth? And a lot of people we have never really seen that, so we're talking about speculation, not much evidence. The fastest, the leader in this is Japan. As anybody who's been there will probably know, you'll see a lot of very elderly people, not very many young people. They don't have immigration. They basically sort of gave up on that idea a long, long time ago. So they're basically letting their population fall. It's changing the workplace, so there's a lot of demand for home aides. So for elderly people, there's not very many young people available to come and work for you. There's no immigrants who can do that. So basically everybody has robots, and they have a lot of social events arranged for older people to try and keep them active, even though they're not in contact with very many young people. So it's changing that economy, but no one's quite sure whether it's going to be, in the long run, very negative or relatively benign.
On that point, who were the replacement labor in their industry?
In China. So they're basically outsourcing a lot of their, the companies in Japan are, fairly innovative companies like Toyota or something, but they're doing a lot of production in lots of other countries.
Okay. Organized labor, unions, positive, negative? They seem to be on a rebound.
Yeah, so that was historically a topic that was very important in my field, labor economics. The origin of the field was probably largely studying what unions did. By the time I got my PhD, trade unions were about 17 or 18% of the workforce in the United States, and now it's down below 9%. So it's been pretty steady decline. There has been a few, upticks, a few victories in unionization drives last year, but I would not expect that to be a big factor. I think I would be extremely surprised if trade unions make a comeback.
Did Amazon unionize?
Amazon had one positive vote in one warehouse, but if you know anything about the way unionization works in the US, you have a vote first, and then if the vote is passed, then there's a long period where they try and negotiate the first contract. And these days, after a vote, only about half of the successes have a first contract. So I would be extremely surprised if Amazon ever has a contract.
Okay. With continuing advancement in open AI, artificial intelligence, what kind of jobs will our grandchildren have, and will there be even bigger gaps with income disparity?
So this is a good question and a very topical one.
Excuse me, you're blocking the closed.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah. So as a sort of a kind of a joke the other day, a bunch of us were sitting around and we got ChatGPT. This is this AI program that you can ask a question, and we said, write an abstract for a paper. So that's when you write an academic paper, there's always a couple of paragraph short description of what the paper does at the beginning. And we asked ChatGPT to give us an abstract for a paper on the effect of robots in the labor market. And ChatGPT thinks that what robots are going to do is going to lead to reductions in employment and wages of lower skilled workers. So that's kind of what ChatGPT does, of course, is it kind of scans through all the literature and finds what things have been said. So the general belief these days, I have not worked on this myself, but the general belief these days is that ongoing automation and AI is probably going to lower opportunities for certain groups of workers. Certain types of jobs appear to be largely immune to AI, like real service jobs like healthcare. To some extent, restaurants. A few years ago, people thought that driving was going to be automated, but now it looks like that's not working nearly as well as people thought. So I would get my money out of Waymo if it was you. So it looks like there's going to be continuing automation, but it might affect more the center of the labor market. So, for instance, I worked at Amazon as a consultant for the last couple of years. And there's a huge amount of automation of all the decision processes involved with inventory and shipping. And if you thought about the way, like years ago, you went to Sears and you ordered something and you got it 3 weeks later. Kind of like Amazon, only it took 3 weeks instead of 2 days. So you had a catalog, you ordered stuff and it would show up in your local Sears store. So what's happened is that we've replaced all the clerks and people who used to be in the back end of Sears with a bunch of computer algorithms which more or less do all that decision making. So those are the kind of jobs that have been replaced by artificial intelligence to some extent. Of course, like basic routine jobs have been replaced by robots, but that actually occurred in the 1960s and 1970s. I worked at GM, General Motors in the 1970s, and already in the 1970s, all the painting of cars was done by robots. So a lot of those kind of routine, somewhat dangerous jobs, of steel factory, a lot of jobs are done by robots, are already roboticized. So that's what I think is going to happen.
Just out of curiosity, in car manufacturing, if you boil it down to man labor hours, what are the labor hours to build a car today compared to, say, 1970?
You know, I honestly don't know the answer to that, Chris. I suspect it's lower, but I don't know.
All right. Well, David, thank you so much. Enjoyed your commentary and your answers to the questions.
Thank you very much for the invitation. All right.
Your compensation.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hart, for your presentation. I enjoyed that very much. And we're about to adjourn the meeting, so I just want to remind you that we'll have a raffle after the meeting.